most recent breaking news. A baby is lost. It has been revealed that there is blood inside the house. And the very people who ought to have been providing him with protection, his parents, are currently being held in custody. We are 7 months old. All that was provided to Emmanuel Haro was that. During the course of 7 months, some cries needed to be answered, nights that called for patience, and a life that was too frail to sustain without daily care. His ability to crawl away from danger was limited. He was unable to run. To ask for assistance, he was unable to even form the words. It was trust in the two adults who pledged to protect his life with their own that was the foundation upon which his entire existence was built. Despite this, here we are. The residence of the family is being searched by law enforcement authorities. Not in quest of information about an intruder, not because they were hunting for fingerprints of a stranger, but rather because they were looking into the people who shared his last name. This is Rebecca Haro. This is Jake Haro. The mother and the father? Titles that were supposed to signify dedication but are now being accused of lying about their intentions. This is not a tale of luck or chance, it is completely different. There is no instance of fate being cruel in this situation. Choices are the subject of this narrative. Individual decisions are taken in private. A set of decisions that left a child without any means of protection, escape, or mercy. In the meantime, neighbors are standing outside, clenching their children even more tightly, and asking themselves the same question that detectives are now being forced to confront. How could the hands that were supposed to comfort Emmanuel become the hands that ultimately caused him harm? In what way may the walls that were supposed to protect him instead reverberate with violence? And this is arguably the most perplexing question of all. How is it that the very individuals who are charged with the responsibility of keeping a newborn alive are the ones who bring an end to his existence, rather than the strangers who knock on the door? Before the flashing lights, before the police raid, and before his name was featured in the news, there was just Emmanuel. He was a baby of 7 months old, little, weak, independent. He was born into a world that required him to struggle a little harder than most people. He came into this world with medical issues that required continual care, respiration that needed monitoring, and a body that required gentleness, patience, and vigilance. Survival was not something that came easily to Emmanuel. It was a test of endurance every day. And each day was a request for protection from the enemy. He was unable to provide for himself. He could not keep his own head stable. His cries were quite quiet, and his breathing was erratic. And yet, among those minuscule sounds was a supplication for solace, for warmth, and for affection. This is the kind of love that ought never to have been called into question. Take a look at the hands of a baby, they are so small and delicate. With his hands coiled around fingers that were larger than his own, Emmanuel grasped at the world with a childlike innocence, oblivious to the perils that it posed. In no way did he ever ask for wealth. Other than warmth and safety, he never asked for any other form of comfort. He never demanded that things be flawless. What he required was nothing more than what every child is entitled to: arms to hold him, eyes to watch over him, and hearts that were prepared to prioritize his requirements over their own. He ought to have been entitled to that from birth. On the other hand, he was provided with a lack of security instead. In place of a household that was consistently filled with care, he was surrounded by apathy that became more pervasive over the course of time. And this is where the cruelest contrast of all may be found. The more vulnerable and smaller Emmanuel became, the more dependent he became on what his parents provided for him. And as he got more and more dependent on them, the inability of them to succeed became intolerable. When a child has nothing but confidence in the world, betrayal is more than just a criminal offense. It is a robbery of his only opportunity to live. There is a backdrop for every tragedy, and every victim has the people who are closest to them, the individuals who contribute to the formation of their reality. In Emmanuel's mind, the two most important people in the world were his parents, Rebecca and Jake Haro. Rebecca gave the impression of being a loving mother to those who were around her. In images, she smiled while holding Emmanuel in her arms, and she talked about the challenges she faces daily as a parent of a child who has special needs. When viewed from the outside, it seemed as though she was giving it her all. On the other hand, fissures started to appear beneath the surface. Those who were closest to her observed moments of detachment, stories that did not always align, and a restlessness that showed more than simply tiredness. Emmanuel's father, Jake, was the next person to appear. A man with a past, a record that had been whispering warnings for a very long time before the disaster occurred. When Jake was younger, he had already been found guilty of child maltreatment in connection with another child during those years. It was a history that ought to have prompted inquiries, a history that ought to have called for more stringent forms of supervision. However, he continued to be present within that house, he continued to be Emmanuel's father, and he continued to have the authority to determine what would happen to Emmanuel. Over the course of their time together, Rebecca and Jake kept up a frail front for the world. They were the epitome of a typical family, greeting their neighbors with smiles and pleasantries and maintaining a distance from the rest of the world during their interactions. However, dysfunction continued to grow behind closed doors. Some hints were not immediately obvious, such as instances in which Emmanuel's medical requirements were disregarded as inconvenient, visits were missed, and medications were not taken. In their hands, the very vigilance that had been necessary to keep him alive became inconsequential. They withdrew from their friends, avoided questions, and concealed the difficulties they were experiencing. It turned out that what appeared to be seclusion was actually a wall. In addition, the burden of responsibility started to lessen as one moved inside that wall. Every slip-up was significant for a child like Emmanuel. The implications of every neglected feeding, every ignored cry, and every broken promise were something that his frail body could not afford to deal with. His life required him to make consistent sacrifices. And rather than responding to that call, Rebecca and Jake started to look away from the situation. Whenever parents abdicate their responsibilities, it is not the world that is the first to face the consequences. He or she is the child. In addition, Emmanuel faced the full burden of their neglect because he was unable to move, unable to talk, and unable to request more than the most fundamental forms of care. Both mother and father are titles that carry a great deal of significance for the Haros. However, a child is not protected just by their titles. It is actions that do. And the deeds that they had been concealing behind locked doors would soon be brought to light in the most catastrophic way that could be imagined. When Emmanuel was reported missing the following morning, Rebecca Haro shared a story that left the investigators in a state of shock. She asserted that she had stopped in a parking lot in order to change the diaper of her infant. She claimed that an unknown person manifested before her, struck her, and rendered her unconscious. Emmanuel was nowhere to be found when she awoke. It was a mother's greatest nightmare, a random act of violence, and a baby was taken away in a matter of seconds, according to anyone who was listening. Panic, fear, and disorientation were all mentioned by Rebecca. The remarks helped to construct a picture of a tragic event that occurred at the hands of an unknown killer. But very quickly, uncertainties began to surface. Inconsistencies were brought to the attention of the officers who listened to her testimony. There was a change in events. Changes were made to the details. There was no response to the inquiries regarding the location. In addition, there was no surveillance film, no witnesses, and no evidence that such an incident ever took place. This is the most significant consideration. Although there were a lot of cameras in the world, not a single one of them had managed to film the alleged kidnapping. However, the community replied in the only way that it was familiar with. Flyers bearing Emmanuel's likeness were printed by a group of neighbors working together. Streets, alleyways, and fields were all scoured by various volunteers. Families prayed for their loved ones' safe return during candlelight vigils that were held in the tranquil evenings. The flames flickered against the darkness as they were held. Unknown individuals who had never met Emmanuel repeated his name, clinging to the hope that he might still be found alive. There was a brief period of time when the Haros was the focal point of sympathy. Rebecca gave off an agitated and frightened appearance as she spoke about her child, who had gone missing, whilst Jake remained more reserved, and his silence was difficult to interpret. In addition, as the rest of the world searched, the police focused their attention on the people within the house rather than the shadows that were outside. Because hope is a potent emotion. On the other hand, confidence starts to dwindle when the evidence does not support the story. The investigators' first glance inside the Haro residence was the moment when optimism started to fade away. A few days after it was announced that Emmanuel had vanished, the investigators refocused their attention on the one location that had always been a major factor in their suspicions: the residence of the Haro family. The property was encircled by law enforcement agents just after sunrise, with their boots stamping down on the dirt driveway and radios making a quiet crackling sound. While they were getting ready to search not for a youngster who had gone missing outside of these walls, but rather for answers that were concealed within them, gloves were snapped into place. Neighbors gathered in a peaceful gathering across the street, cradling coffee mugs and cuddling their children close to them as they watched the house that they had previously waved at in passing being blocked off with police tape. While others shook their heads in bewilderment, others mumbled prayers in a murmuring voice. All of them waited, hoping that the search would unearth some indication that had been ignored, any glimmer of expectation. When officers entered the building, they moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the relatively dim light. Every inch of a house that should have been filled with the warmth of a newborn but instead seemed chilly, empty, and silent was examined by them. They investigated the flooring, the walls, and the corners. Furthermore, they discovered it. There were traces of blood. There were a few stains that were barely noticeable but could not be denied. Some marks could not be explained away by a diaper change or a scraped knee. In contrast to the account that Emmanuel's parents had provided, there was evidence that told a quite different scenario. The house that Rebecca asserted had been broken into, which was also the house where Emmanuel was meant to be safe, turned out to be the precise place where the violence took place. The deception started to come to light, and along with them, the mask of parenthood was removed. Within the evening, the arrests were made. The expressions of Rebecca and Jake Haro were no longer those of mourning parents, rather, they were those of suspects in the murder of their own child. They were hauled from their home in handcuffs and shoved into the back of squad cars without any explanation. Furthermore, as the news circulated across the town, the shock was almost too much for anyone to endure. Women shed tears in public. Many fathers clenched their fists around their children. Residents who had previously expressed their condolences now stood in startled silence, having realized that the horror was not located outside of their neighborhood but rather within it. Trust has been destroyed. There was no longer any mention of a kidnapping. There was still the possibility that Emmanuel had never left that house alive, which was a much more serious situation. When blood evidence was discovered inside the Haro residence, the inquiry went into high gear and became more thorough. What started as a case involving a missing individual is now being investigated as a homicide. Every step of Rebecca and Jake's story was gone over by the detectives. It was determined that surveillance footage from highways and parking lots was examined. They looked over the timetable that she had provided, looking for any evidence that could back up their claims. Instead of discovering evidence of kidnapping, they discovered the disintegration of a story that had been created. There was no offender present. There is no battle in the parking lot. No stranger was concealing themselves in the darkness with a child. The only thing that remained was stillness, precisely the kind of silence that pointed back to Rebecca and Jake themselves. The history of Jake Haro came back to the surface as the police investigated deeper, like a shadow that had never been removed. An earlier conviction for child maltreatment involving another child had been handed down to him many years ago. That ought to have been a warning siren that was loud enough to call for help immediately. Despite this, Emmanuel continued to reside in his home, continued to rely on him for care, and continued to depend on a guy who had previously let down a child. In light of this, a nagging question arose: how could something like this have been permitted to take place? Why did the system fail to take action? When Emmanuel was a vulnerable and dependent child, how did he end up in the custody of a father who was previously known to be abusive? There were failures not only inside the family, but also throughout the organizations that were supposed to protect children in situations where the parents were unable to do so. Opportunities were lost by social service organizations. There were holes in the oversight. Cracks that children are supposed to be protected from turned out to be the precise cracks that Emmanuel was able to slip through. The journalists converged on the scene as soon as the arrests were reported. Screams may be heard throughout the nation's headlines. Parents have been arrested in connection with the death of a 7-month-old child. With microphones in their hands, reporters flooded the neighborhood, spreading the word about Emmanuel's accomplishments to each and every home. With every hour that went by, the level of outrage increased. Not only was this a criminal act, but it was also a scandalous breach of trust that infuriated parents all around the world. The community was in mourning. Those neighbors who had been searching for Emmanuel in the fields now gathered together at vigils with lighting. It is no longer for his safe return that we pray, rather, we pray for justice. The question that they posed was heard everywhere, from doorsteps to churches to national broadcasts. How could something like this take place right here in our village? To what extent is it possible for a newborn to disappear from within his own house and never be found alive again? Despite everything that took place, Emmanuel's body was never found. There were other aspects of his absence as well. Every person who said his name felt as though they were being weighed down by a weight. The empty crib of a child. Toys that have not been played with. A life that was obliterated without the opportunity to develop. Despite all of the evidence that was gathered and all of the fury that was expressed in the media, the most important piece of the puzzle was still missing: Emmanuel himself. Furthermore, the reality of his suffering became even more burdensome and even more intolerable to contemplate as a result of his absence. One infant has not been found as of tonight. The evidence purports to point to something horrific, according to the investigators. It has not been possible to locate Emmanuel. He has not yet slept in his cot. His playthings have not been touched. The lingering shadow of his disappearance is like a question that no one can answer at this time. Both Rebecca and Jake Haro are currently being held in detention, accused of the most heinous crime that a parent could ever commit. They do not give a fresh account. They do not elucidate the situation. In addition, as the days turn into weeks, the weight of their quiet becomes increasingly intense. When Emmanuel was inside that house, what happened to him? The walls seem to be whispering about violence, yet the parents are insisting that we tell lies. Because there is no corpse to lay to rest and no certainty to cling to, why is it necessary for a community to grieve at vigils? It is not yet time to close. This is a state of limbo. One child is stuck in the center of a family that has been damaged and a community that has been shattered. His fate hovered between the proof and the issues that remained unanswered. The bigger fact, however, continues to be the case. Emmanuel needed to be careful. He required covert protection. Because he earned it. Furthermore, if the parents who were entrusted with his life were unable to provide for it, then their failure is already apparent in the anguish that he is experiencing. In the story of Emmanuel Haro, the story is not yet complete. Before his fate is determined, it is impossible to complete it. A frightening notion is left for us as a result of this, and that is the following: if a newborn is not safe in the arms of his parents, then where can one truly find safety? The struggle to find answers progresses in tandem with the hunt for answers. In his own words, Emmanuel is unable to speak. We can refuse to allow his name to be buried in silence. Carry on with us. To keep up with every single step of this inquiry, every single piece of evidence, and every single demand for justice, you need to subscribe to this channel. Mainly because Emmanuel's tale is not yet finished, and neither is our responsibility to him.